Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today we enter a new period in our APUSH timeline of Period 7. Period 7 is an important segment in American history of the 55 or so, I would argue, most important years in the entire history of our country. So in an effort to carefully tell this segment of American history, we'll divide it into two parts. Period 7, Part 1, which I'll refer to as Modernity. Modernity because it's when America emerges to begin to kind of look like the country we're used to today. And then Period 7, Part 2 of the American century, establishing what would be America's dominance really through the latter half of the 20th century, continuing into our maybe own modern era. So turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's APUSH. History class rides again! We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to explain why the city was a central element for the progressive movement in the United States. You should be able to assess the ways in which the labor and women's movements challenged the 19th century notions of American freedom. And you should be able to compare and contrast the democratic and anti-democratic impulses of the progressive era. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. Here I want to talk about how the urban age was coming about. But let's focus not first in cities, but back onto the farms. Well, for the first time in American history, farms and cities were growing at the same time. The United States economy grew by 85% between 1900 and 1910 as agriculture entered what would be remembered as a golden age. Growing cities meant there was increasing demand for farm products that couldn't be produced, in the city, and new irrigation techniques was increasing the amount of arable farmland and, ability to grow crops there. You also had the Homestead Act of 1862 really kicking in to go promote settlement in the Great Plains. But it was the city that became the focus of progressive politics and a new mass consumer society. With 4.7 million residents in 1910, New York became the largest city, and it was really the symbol of a modern society. It's what people began to think of when they imagined urban America. They imagined New York in that model. There were stark divisions, though, between the rich and the poor. Newly arrived immigrants on the Lower East Side of New York, they didn't have electricity or even indoor toilets. Meanwhile, Millionaires Row on Fifth Avenue was boasting huge mansions. Subpoint B, by 1900, every major city had at least one art gallery. And many art galleries and libraries rose the cultural standards of their cities, and they'd become so common in major cities, they were often referred to as the poor man's university, where anybody could go understand the cultural pieces of the world. While the 19th century artists like the Hudson River School were producing famous works of art which celebrated and romanticized nature, the new Ashcan School was showing urban scenes like crowded bars and theaters and soaring skyscrapers and electric lights. This was a gritty, no-frills style of art that showed the sides of urban living that a lot of people wanted to overlook. And you saw the movement from a romanticized understanding of nature to kind of like the gritty underbelly of American life. European abstract art was also emerging in the early 20th century, although a lot of people found it pretty hard to understand and fairly unrelatable, at least in the United States. Subpoint C, a new generation of journalists was writing for mass circulation national magazines, and they exposed the ills of industrial and urban life. And here I want to introduce you to a few of the more notable ones. The first one is Lincoln Steffens. His book, Shame of the Cities, was published not originally as a book, but as a series of articles in McClure's magazine, but then later spun off as a single volume. McClure's also hired Ida Tarbell to go expose the deceitful practices of John D. Rockefeller. Her History of the Standard Oil Company was a monthly column in McClure's magazine, was also spun off into a single book as well. But by far the most influential novelist, not journalist, was Upton Sinclair, whose novel The Jungle was an attempt to organize socialist worker movements. While Upton Sinclair thought of himself as a journalist and approached some parts of the novel as journalism, it was, as a whole, a fictional work. The book told a story of a poor Lithuanian immigrant family exploited by business deals who was mistreated by employers and laboring in unsafe conditions to go produce unsafe food. The Jungle was one of those monumental books that became the book to read, and it prompted the Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Subpoint D. In 1890, the first shopping center opened in Cleveland, a 5-story glass-topped arcade shopping mall with live bands and a department store. In 1865, Marshall Field even opened the first department store in the city of Chicago. Marshall Field found that women, if they got personal service, if a clerk would go deal with customers individually, it would raise sales considerably. So the store motto of Marshall Field's became, "Give the lady what she wants," and it was an intensely personal shopping experience. Chain stores were offering the same merchandise under the same owners across in several locations for less than locally owned stores, and because they were able to buy in quantity and limit personal service, while Marshall Field's was giving the lady what she wants with extreme personal service. On the other hand, Woolworths by the 1870s was, just leaving open aisles where people could go do the shopping for themselves. And F.W. Woolworth discovered that customers would even go impulse purchase super cheap goods that they could pick up on their own. By 1911, the Woolworths chain had 596 stores and was doing $1 million in sales every week. In 1872, Ward's catalog was a single sheet of paper, but it debuted to go, push its catalog wares throughout the country. Richard Sears began his company in 1886. Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck catalogs would bring goods to small towns and basically give access to people that didn't have national chains or important buying power, give them the ability to go buy off a catalog and be shipped to their locations as well. In 1865, the era of the Civil War, businesses were spending $10 million on advertising, but by the 20th century, that became $95 million a year sent up in advertising expenses. The biggest spenders were patent medicines and soaps and baking powders, with ads that were running in periodicals and billboards and even painting the entire side of a building. Subpoint E. Here I want to talk about a business practice that we sometimes refer to as Fordism, because it originated with Henry Ford of the Model T automobile. Henry Ford focused on standardizing output, and by standardizing output would then go on to lower prices for consumers. Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile. Like a lot of technological developments, the automobile was just sort of pieces that would emerge along the way. But he revolutionized its manufacturer. Inspired by a butcher's trolley in Chicago meatpacking plant, he used a similar boy, I kind of messed up my hair on that one. He used a similar method to go manufacture cars. The Ford Model T was a simple car. It was a light vehicle, which was sturdy enough to go navigate the poor roads of the country. Originally, it was available in several colors, but Ford eventually streamlined that production, quipping that customers can get a Model T in any color they want, as long as they want black. Faced with repetitive, boring work, Ford paid his employees $5 a day. It was a huge amount of money to stop workers from quitting. Basically, to go work on a Ford assembly line wasn't a very exciting job. You did the same thing every day, but Ford paid them a lot of money to stay in that work. And in fact, one of the side benefits was that a Ford employee could even afford to go buy a Ford automobile. Roman numeral number 2. Broadly speaking, the progressive movement, and we'll refer to kind of this era in American history as the progressive movement. It's kind of a successor to the populist movement, which we learned about in our last unit. But broadly speaking, progressivism as a cultural political movement had a few goals to it. They were protecting social welfare, promoting moral improvement, fostering economic reform, and but fostering efficiency. They were kind of related to making what could be a modern society for people. And let's talk about them individually. And the first one we'll talk about is industrial freedom. Frederick W. Taylor was a sociologist who pioneered the idea of scientific management. Principles like time and motion studies would watch how a task would be done and then try to break down that task into the smallest number of units possible, into simple and repetitive parts. This scientific management allowed shorter work turnover basically it allowed people to go do their jobs more efficiently. but it also kind of took a lot of the skill and fun out of a job. And so worker turnover became pretty high. These jobs became boring and repetitive and basically traded people like machines, these jobs that people just didn't stay with it after a while. They would just quit their job. But it came with a certain benefit because the jobs became more fast and you could get your work done in a shorter amount of time. So it allowed for shorter work days and even higher pay along the way. The scientific management was in industrial work, but kind of the spirit of turning your job into the simplest units would carry over into white-collar production as well. As white-collar workers were also feeling this loss of freedom in the workplace. They earned higher wages than manual workers, but white-collar workers, their jobs also became dull and mechanical, and while it paid more with shorter work days, it came kind of at a lesser quality of life. Subpoint C. The 1893 financial panic prompted doubts about capitalism. Essentially, in 1893, the banks, went through a set of shocks and the economy tanked, and people were like, ooh, is this maybe the end of capitalist America? One of those kind of like recurring themes in American financial history. And Americans fed up with the economic system, particularly workers who felt kicked around in the changing economy. They became socialists. And in 1901, labor leader Eugene V. Debs organized the Socialist Party. We've met Eugene V. Debs before. He's the organizer of the important railroad strikes through the populist era. And in 1901, he becomes a full-on socialist and leads the Socialist Political Party of America. The Socialist Party brought together surviving late 19th century radicals. Debs even ran for president in 1912 under the socialist ticket. Subpoint D. Samuel Gomper's AFL, the American Federation of Labor, it sought to forge closer ties with forward-looking corporate leaders who were willing to deal with unions as a way to stabilize Americans' employee relations. Membership in the AFL tripled, and industrial leaders tended to prefer the AFL's moderate policies. A group who rejected the AFL's exclusionary policies formed a different union known as the Industrial Workers of the World. You'll sometimes hear the IWW referred to as the Wobblies, and it's kind of a fun nickname. I don't actually know why they call them that. But the IWW was organized by radical unionists and socialists. The IWW included African Americans and was always kind of flirting with the edge of socialism and political reform, not just economic change. Subpoint E. We also see the development of a new style of feminism here at the turn of the century. Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman was a noted anarchist and lecturer. Anarchism today is not seen as a real viable political movement, but certainly here in the progressive era it was. But she was a lecturer, and she would go from city to city to go promote ideas of feminism, but also of political reform and even political end. She traveled the country to speak at rallies on sexual freedom and access to birth control. She was arrested somewhere around 40 times in different cities on obscenity charges. A lot of them were kind of trumped up charges, essentially just to keep Emma Goldman from, having any public appearance along the way. The next person I want you to meet is Margaret Sanger. And I'm going to tell a side of Margaret Sanger that's heavily based in her own works. And I'll be honest with you, it's not the conventional story that you'll often hear from Sanger in American history textbooks, but an effort to, let her speak in her own words. Margaret Sanger placed the issue of birth control at the heart of new feminism. In 1921, Margaret Sanger founded the American Birth Control League. And the goals of this league were spelled out in a lot of Sanger's books. In her 1920 work, Women in the New Race, Sanger explained that undesirable immigrants, which she specifically lists as Negroes, Indians, and Chinese, not to mention Eastern and Central Europeans, these undesirable immigrants were going to overwhelm the native-born white people of America. And the country needed a constructive way to promote what she called the better races. She writes, "What material is there for a greater American race? What elements make up our own present millions? And where do they live? And how do they live? And in what direction does our national civilization bend their ideals? What effect is the melting pot upon the foreigner once he begins to melt? Are we now producing a freer, juster, more intelligent, more idealistic, and creative people out of the varied ingredients along here?" And Sanger will go on to argue, no, that all of these things don't make America better, and that you really need to stop the new races from coming into America, and furthermore, to keep those races from reproducing confusing and muddying the waters of the American people. She wrote in her 1922 book, The Pivot of Civilization, that the specific goal of the American Birth Control League was to create a race of well-born children by limiting reckless breeding among peoples who have genetic tendencies to crime, as if some people are just born into a life of crime, or have mental and physical defects, so people that just aren't fit enough to have children. And also to ensure racial progress through a practice known as eugenics, by sterilizing feeble-minded people who just aren't smart enough, they shouldn't have children. And birth control, therefore controlling the world's problems by controlling the number of problematic people that would be allowed to be born. She writes, the American Birth Control League aims to enlighten and educate all sections of the American public in various aspects in the dangers of uncontrolled procreation and the imperative necessity of a world birth control program. The League aims to correlate the findings of scientists and statisticians, investigators, and social agencies in all fields, and is therefore necessary to organize various departments, things like research and investigation, and hygienic and physiological instruction, and sterilization, and educational practices, and political practices, and legislative practices, organization, international practices, and all of these things, she says, are there. So the American Birth Control League proposes to publish, and it's an official organ, the American Birth Control Review, reports and studies in the relationship of controlled and uncontrolled populations to national and world problems. Essentially saying that all of these things, if we could just stop these undesirable people from reproducing, we could make all kinds of progress in America. Today, the American Birth Control League is no longer known by that name. It's referred to as Planned Parenthood, and it keeps 78% of its clinics in or within walking distance of minority neighborhoods. It provides black women with 29.7 abortions per 1,000 women, compared with just 8 per 1,000 women for white people. It's as if Margaret Sanger's goals of keeping all of these non-white, non-special people from having children are coming wildly true. Roman numeral number 3. Here we're going to talk about the real politics of progressivism. And progressivism made claims for promoting freedom. Progressivism was an international movement as cities throughout the world experienced similar social strains and rapid industrialization and urban growth. Progressives assumed that the modern era required a fundamental rethinking and functions of political authority. Drawing on political reforms of the Gilded Age and the example of European legislation, progressives sought to reinvigorate the idea of an activist, socially conscious government. They rejected the assumption that a powerful government proposed a threat to freedom because their understanding of freedom itself was in flux in this era. Subpoint B, state and local governments enacted most of the reform efforts. Here I want to introduce you to Hazen Pingree. Hazen Pingree was the mayor of Detroit who pioneered urban progressivism. He was an economics-minded mayor who tackled taxes and tried to make the tax structure fairer. He lowered transit fares for public transit and tried to root out corruption in urban city government. He set up a work program for the unemployed and building schools and parks and a city power plant. The next person you'll meet is Tom Johnson. He was the socialist mayor of Cleveland from 1901 to 1909. And he took on corrupt utilities, trying to fire greedy and corrupt private owners, and tried to nationalize programs like the gas works and the water works and transit lines. Tom Johnson held his city meetings not on the 5th floor of City Hall away from the public, but in city meetings in large circus tents. And he invited the public to go question officials about city management. But the most important official and the most, I think, influential of the progressive era at the state level was that of Robert La Follette, the 3-time governor of Wisconsin, before becoming a United States Senator from Wisconsin, who made Wisconsin, he said, a laboratory for democracy. He instituted primaries rather than party nominations for offices, making elections along the way to try to improve the democratic process within the democratic process. He was known as Fightin' Bob, and he attacked big business, saying that he didn't want to smash big business, but he definitely wanted to keep business out of politics and to be treated like any other business or any other person, not getting an advantage just because they're major industries. La Follette's biggest target was the railroad industry, saying that the railroad should be taxed at the same rates as other types of businesses. They shouldn't get preferential treatment by the government, which they'd been getting since the era right after the Civil War. He set up a commission to go regulate taxes and to go stop corrupt payoffs to politicians. Subpoint C. Organized women reformers spoke on the more democratic side of progressivism, placing on political agenda new understandings of female freedom. In 1899, Jane Addams, a committed social gospelist, she founded Hull House with Ellen Gates Starr. Hull House was a settlement house in Chicago for European immigrants. Jane Addams was typical of the new woman of the progressive era. She was college educated, she was middle class, and she was devoted to providing social services. Subpoint C. Susan B. Anthony was a leading crusader for the campaign for women's suffrage, and under her leadership, women's suffrage became a mass movement. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA, to go promote electoral equality. Because women were facing constant opposition to suffrage, some people figured that if women got the right to vote, the first thing they would do was go outlaw alcohol. Or others feared that women could outlaw child labor. And others feel that women would, if they got the right to vote, it would disrupt women's traditional roles. By 1900, more than half of the states, though, were allowing women to vote in local elections dealing with school issues. And 4 Western states, Wyoming was the first, gave women outright full suffrage. Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah were all giving women even full votes in the presidential process. Subpoint E. Here I want to talk about progressives' approaches towards protecting women and what becomes known as a maternalistic reform. And let's focus on the Supreme Court case of Mueller versus Oregon of 1908. And it upheld the constitutionality of an Oregon law setting maximum work hours for women. Arguing before the Supreme Court of the United States, attorney Louis Brandeis argued in favor of this law, citing social research saying that women had less strength than men, and so they shouldn't be subjected to the same long working hours that men do. And because women were the ones who bore children, the government had a legitimate interest in protecting them for the sake of their country. Basically saying that women are a protected class and need to have workplace protections that are different than men, and they shouldn't be forced to work the same long hours that men do. And he doesn't make this argument with legal briefs like would normally done with precedent and laws and how courts have ruled on the past, but on social science evidence, which becomes known as the Brandeis brief, and became a new legal technique, relying not on legal precedent or references to law, but on social science to go make its claim. But Brandeis wasn't a protectionist, at least not in the big picture. He wanted universal economic entitlements, like a right to a decent income and government assistance derived from citizenship itself, and arguing that all citizens were entitled to help. Brandeis and other progressives were successful in establishing new minimum wage laws and unemployment protection and workers' compensation laws, and this really becomes the change of the progressive movement to promote a greater sense of democracy in the country, but also a more responsiveness of the government to the needs of the people. This change will have a ripple effect that will carry out in ways that we haven't even seen yet. It's a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.